when a woman walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom expecting special treatment. She had no idea what was coming next. Moments after she tried calling her husband to fix everything, Judge Caprio delivered a response so savage, so unexpected, that the entire courtroom went silent. On a calm morning inside Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, the atmosphere carried a usual blend of nervous energy and quiet anticipation. People sat in rows clutching their tickets and paperwork, hoping for leniency or understanding. Most of them looked tired or anxious, but none expected anything unusual from the day. That was before a woman named Emily Carver stepped forward, poised, confident, and radiating the air of someone who believed she already knew exactly how the next few minutes would unfold. Emily, 42, dressed sharply and composed perfection, held a citation for a school zone parking violation. Most defendants walked up humbled or apologetic. Emily walked up with the swagger of someone who felt she had the advantage even before she spoke. Judge Caprio gave her his familiar warm greeting and explained the charge. But Emily, instead of listening carefully or preparing a reasonable explanation, offered him a crisp smile that carried a tone of superiority. She told him she could clear everything up faster. Judge Caprio waited, expecting a typical explanation. A sick child, a misunderstanding, anything. But Emily's confidence had another source. She casually mentioned that her husband worked with the state and that she could simply give him a quick call to straighten things out. The courtroom shifted instantly. People exchanged glances. Even the bailiff looked surprised. It was the kind of moment where everyone suddenly knew that this hearing was not going to follow the usual script. Before Judge Caprio could respond, Emily confidently lifted her phone and insisted that it would only take 2 minutes. She made it sound like she was doing the judge a favor by cutting the process short. She dialed the number and put the phone on speaker, letting the ringing echo through the silent courtroom. Every pair of eyes focused on her, and still she looked unbothered, tapping her finger impatiently as she waited for her husband to answer. When he finally picked up, sounding rushed and irritated, Emily spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear. She instructed him to tell Judge Caprio who you are, and added that she did not deserve the ticket. The arrogance in her tone was impossible to ignore. In that moment, the entire courtroom experienced a collective pause. It was a kind of silence that felt heavy, stretching out as people instinctively turned their eyes toward Judge Caprio. They all knew he wasn't the type to be easily swayed by influence or intimidation, but they also knew that Emily had crossed a line few dared to cross. She had tried to bypass the justice system right in front of him. Judge Caprio observed her calmly, his expression revealing nothing and everything at the same time. He wasn't angry. He was simply waiting, processing, preparing. The courtroom could almost feel the tension building, because while Emily believed she was controlling the moment, everyone else realized she was walking straight into a response she was absolutely not prepared for. And that response was going to be savage. The moment Emily's husband's voice filled the courtroom through the speakerphone, the dynamic of the room shifted even more. His tone was sharp and impatient, the voice of a man interrupted during something he considered more important. "Emily, what is this?" "I told you I'm in a meeting," he hissed, clearly annoyed. But Emily, feeling the eyes of the courtroom on her, stood even straighter, as if this display of influence were meant to impress everyone. She spoke loudly and deliberately, announcing that she was standing in front of Judge Caprio and needed her husband to tell him who he is so the matter could be dismissed. The entitlement in her voice cut through the silence like a blade. Judge Caprio watched her with a calmness that felt almost unreal. He had seen countless excuses, emotional appeals, and genuine mistakes throughout his years on the bench. But rarely had he seen someone attempt to leverage personal connection so boldly and so publicly, especially in a courtroom known for fairness, compassion, and the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved an equal chance. The courtroom spectators sensed he was giving Emily just enough rope to reveal her intentions completely, and she was doing exactly that. On the other end of the call, her husband sounded increasingly uncomfortable. "Emily, why are you putting me on speaker?" "You shouldn't be calling me for this," he muttered, his voice dropping when he realized he was being broadcast across a courtroom. But Emily, determined to maintain her performance, spoke even louder. "Just tell him what you do. Tell him you can clear this up." Her insistence wasn't just desperate. It was embarrassing, especially as her husband's reluctance became obvious. The more she pushed, the more awkward the situation became, and whispers rippled through the benches as people exchanged looks of disbelief. Finally, her husband sighed, a long, weary sound that filled the room with tension. "Your Honor," he said reluctantly, "I'm sorry about this. I told my wife not to call me for things like this." His words cut through everything Emily had been trying to project. Her shoulders stiffened, and for the first time since she entered the courtroom, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She tried to interject, but her husband continued, clearly embarrassed. "I can't interfere with a legal matter. Please, just handle it properly." The crowd felt the impact like a sudden shift in temperature. Emily's strategy had crumbled in front of everyone. What she thought would impress had instead exposed her in the worst way possible. Her attempt to pull strings had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly. She lowered the phone slightly, her confident posture faltering. The courtroom watched her carefully, not with cruelty, but with a stunned curiosity about what Judge Caprio would do next. And that was the moment Judge Caprio leaned forward ever so slightly, the hint of a thoughtful smile appearing on his face. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even stern. He simply looked ready to deliver the kind of response Emily and the entire courtroom would never forget. Emily slowly lowered her phone, her confidence now clearly cracked. The courtroom remained suspended in tense silence, every eye fixed on her as she clicked off the call. What she thought would be a triumphant moment had instead become a public unraveling. She looked around, at the judge, at the audience, at the bailiff, and for the first time, the weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. Her attempt to use power had failed not discreetly, but loudly, with her husband openly refusing to interfere. It was a dramatic collapse that no one in the room had expected. Judge Caprio let the silence linger for a moment longer, as if allowing the atmosphere itself to settle. Then, with the calm voice he was known for, he gently broke the tension. "Ma'am," he said softly, "are you finished with your call?" His tone wasn't mocking or aggressive. It was composed and deliberate, a tone that carried more authority than any outburst ever could. Emily swallowed hard and nodded, clutching her phone like a shield that no longer protected her. "Yes, Your Honor," she murmured. But Judge Caprio, wise and composed, wasn't interested in shaming her. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, folding his hands with a patience that carried decades of experience. "Let me explain something to you," he began. His voice was steady, though every word felt like it was cutting through the last remnants of Emily's misplaced confidence. "This courtroom does not run on favors. It does not run on family names or connections or influence. It runs on fairness and fairness alone." The courtroom felt those words deeply. People who had come with their own anxieties suddenly sat a little taller, as if reassured that justice still lived here. Emily's eyes shifted downward, her earlier pride now replaced with a quiet discomfort. Judge Caprio continued, his tone still gentle but undeniably firm. "What you attempted to do," he said, "is undermine the very system that protects every person in this room, including you." Emily opened her mouth slightly, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, but no words came out. The truth was too heavy to dodge. She had exposed herself, and now she had to stand in the consequence of it. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority came from clarity, not aggression. "It's important," he continued, "to understand that being married to someone in the state does not place you above the law, and your husband understands that." He made that quite clear. The mention of her husband's refusal stung her visibly. Her shoulders curled in slightly, and she blinked quickly, struggling to maintain composure. But Caprio wasn't finished. He added, "The law treats everyone equally, and I will treat you as I treat any other citizen who stands before me." A murmur of approval spread softly through the courtroom, not loud enough to disrupt, but strong enough to show that people felt a sense of justice unfolding in real time. Emily looked around again, this time with humility rather than entitlement. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Judge Caprio studied her for a moment, then prepared to issue his next words, ones that the courtroom could feel coming like a distant rumble. The real judgment hadn't begun yet. The real lesson was still to come. But Judge Caprio, wise and composed, wasn't interested in shaming her. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, folding his hand with a patience that carried decades of experience. "Let me explain something to you," he began. His voice was steady, though every word felt like it was cutting through the last remnants of Emily's misplaced confidence. "This courtroom does not run on favors. It does not run on family names or connections or influence. It runs on fairness and fairness alone." The courtroom felt those words deeply. People who had come with their own anxieties suddenly sat a little taller, as if reassured that justice still lived here. Emily's eyes shifted downward, her earlier pride now replaced with a quiet discomfort. Judge Caprio continued, his tone still gentle but undeniably firm. "What you attempted to do," he said, "is undermine the very system that protects every person in this room, including you." Emily opened her mouth slightly, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, but no words came out. The truth was too heavy to dodge. She had exposed herself, and now she had to stand in the consequence of it. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority came from clarity, not aggression. "It's important," he continued, "to understand that being married to someone in the state does not place you above the law, and your husband understands that." He made that quite clear. The mention of her husband's refusal stung her visibly. Her shoulders curled in slightly, and she blinked quickly, struggling to maintain composure. But Caprio wasn't finished. He added, "The law treats everyone equally, and I will treat you as I treat any other citizen who stand before me." A murmur of approval spread softly through the courtroom, not loud enough to disrupt, but strong enough to show that people felt a sense of justice unfolding in real time. Emily looked around again, this time with humility rather than entitlement. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Judge Caprio studied her for a moment, then prepared to issue his next words, ones that the courtroom could feel coming like a distant rumble. The real judgment hadn't begun yet. The real lesson was still to come. To a quiet stillness settled over the room as Judge Caprio prepared to continue. Emily stood with her hands clasped together, her earlier confidence completely dissolved. The transformation was unmistakable. She no longer looked like someone trying to leverage influence, but rather someone coming to terms with a moment that had exposed her far more than she intended. The courtroom, once buzzing with whispers, now sat almost reverently silent, as if everyone sensed that the turning point of this story was about to unfold. Judge Caprio shifted the paperwork in front of him and spoke with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the harshness of the situation. "Let's talk about the actual violation," he said. It was a reminder that despite all the drama, despite the embarrassing phone call and the attempt to use personal connections, the heart of the matter still came down to a single citation. A simple parking violation in a school zone, something that should have been straightforward, ordinary, even, but because of the path Emily chose, it had spiraled into something much larger. Emily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Yes, Your Honor." There was no hint of argument now, no attempt to justify or deflect, just the quiet humility of someone who had learned a hard lesson in front of dozens of strangers. Judge Caprio continued reading the details aloud, explaining that the violation occurred during school hours, a time when children were being picked up and dropped off, precisely the period when extra caution mattered most. His tone was not accusatory. It was measured, almost educational. The judge explained how laws like this weren't created to frustrate drivers, but to protect vulnerable children. He described how parents, teachers, and crossing guards relied on drivers to follow the rules, because one careless decision could lead to a moment of irreversible tragedy. As he spoke, his words painted a picture that went far beyond a simple fine. They highlighted responsibility, community, and the importance of considering others, a perspective Emily clearly hadn't embraced when she first entered the courtroom. A shift happened in the audience. People were no longer watching for drama. They were listening, absorbing, reflecting. And Emily's face softened as she listened. The defensiveness was gone. Instead, she appeared genuinely moved by the judge's explanation. It was becoming clear that this experience, as humiliating as it had been, was teaching her something deeper than any financial penalty ever could. When Judge Caprio finished explaining the stakes of such violations, he looked directly at Emily. "Now that you understand the seriousness of the situation," he said, "do you have anything you want to say before I make a decision?" The question hung in the air like a bridge, a chance for her to walk across with sincerity or retreat with excuses. Emily took a slow breath. When she spoke, her tone was soft but steady. "I didn't think about any of that," she admitted. "I treated this like it wasn't a big deal. And I treated this courtroom like I didn't have to respect it. I was wrong." She paused, her eyes momentarily glistening. "I'm truly sorry." Her words carried a vulnerability that struck the room more effectively than any excuse she could have given. This was no longer the same woman who had confidently dialed her husband seconds earlier. This was someone who had finally faced herself. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, acknowledging the shift in her demeanor. The moment felt heavy, meaningful, like the entire room was holding its breath. The judge was now poised to respond, and everyone sensed that whatever came next would shape the final arc of this extraordinary encounter. The courtroom felt suspended in a delicate balance as Judge Caprio prepared to respond. Emily's apology lingered in the air, sincere and unguarded, a stark contrast to the entitled confidence she had displayed earlier. Even the spectators, who had initially watched with amusement, now felt a quiet empathy settle over them. This was no longer a spectacle. It had become a moment of genuine accountability and human connection. Judge Caprio took a slow breath, his fingertips resting gently on the bench, his expression thoughtful rather than stern. "Mrs. Carver," he began, his tone calm but carrying the weight of decades of wisdom, "what happened here today wasn't about the violation itself. It was about perspective. It was about humility. And it was about understanding that justice does not bend because of who we know." He paused, allowing the words to fully sink in. Emily nodded softly, her gaze fixed on him, as if holding on to every syllable. For the first time, she wasn't trying to get ahead of the process. She was letting the process guide her. "But," Judge Caprio continued, "it is also about acknowledging when someone recognizes their mistake." His voice softened even further, almost paternal in its warmth. "You stood here and admitted you were wrong. You took responsibility. That matters." A subtle shift rippled through the courtroom. People leaned forward, sensing something unexpected forming in the judge's tone, something that didn't match the harsh punishment some might have anticipated. He continued, "We all make errors in judgment. What defines us is whether we learn from them." The compassion in his voice was unmistakable now, filling the room with surprising warmth. Emily blinked rapidly, emotions welling up as she waited for the decision. "Your attempt to use influence was inappropriate," the judge said firmly. "But your willingness to acknowledge that shows character. And sometimes, character deserves grace." The room fell completely still. Emily's eyes widened just slightly, as if she weren't sure she had heard him correctly. Judge Caprio leaned back, his expression gentle. "I'm going to do something you probably didn't expect," he said. "I'm going to dismiss the citation." A quiet gasp stirred through the room. Even Emily stood frozen, stunned by the turn of events. But Judge Caprio raised a hand softly. "Not because of your connection, not because of your husband, but because you learned the right lesson here, and the court believes in second chances." A wave of relief washed over Emily's face, mingled with gratitude and disbelief. She didn't smile arrogantly this time. She didn't boast or lift her chin. Instead, she placed a hand over her heart and exhaled shakily. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "Thank you for giving me that chance. I won't forget it." Judge Caprio nodded gently. "See that you don't." His words were not a warning, but a gentle reminder, a final piece of guidance offered from a place of wisdom rather than authority. The spectators looked on with newfound respect. What could have ended as a hard punishment instead became something more profound, a demonstration that justice, when tempered with humanity, could transform rather than simply penalize. And in that moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and more like a place where people could truly change. As Emily stepped back from the podium, the courtroom seemed to exhale with her. The tension that had hung in the air for so long melted into something softer, something almost inspiring. She returned to her seat slowly, every movement reflecting the gravity of what had just happened. People would watch her stumble, fall, and finally rise again with humility, now looked at her with a quiet respect. Not because she had escaped a fine, but because she had walked through a moment that could have hardened her, and instead, it had softened her in all the right ways. Judge Caprio gathered the paperwork and prepared for the next case, but the energy in the room didn't instantly reset. It lingered. The spectators whispered to each other, not with a judgment they might have held earlier, but with admiration for the humanity they had witnessed. More than one person remarked that this was why Judge Caprio had earned so much respect, not just as a judge, but as a man who understood that the law was only one part of justice. The other part was empathy. Emily sat quietly, her eyes lowered, processing the whirlwind of events. Her heart beat a little faster, not from embarrassment anymore, but from the overwhelming relief of a second chance she hadn't expected. She thought about her husband's voice on the phone, steady and unwilling to bend the rules for her. She thought about the judge's calm wisdom, his unwavering fairness, and the lesson he had carved so deeply into the moment that she knew it would stay with her long after she walked out of that courtroom. When her case was officially closed, she rose from her seat and approached the exit. But before she could reach the doors, a soft voice called out from behind, "Ma'am." It was the bailiff. Emily turned, expecting another instruction. Instead, he simply offered her a small nod. "You handle that well in the end," he said. "Not everyone does." His words weren't grand, but they struck her with unexpected warmth. She smiled gently, something humble and real. "Thank you," she replied. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt brighter, sharper, almost symbolic. Emily stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, wiping a small tear she didn't want anyone to see. She had walked into that building thinking she was untouchable. She walked out knowing she was no different than anyone else. And that understanding didn't diminish her. It strengthened her. As she walked toward her car, she replayed the judge's final words in her mind. "See that you don't." Not a warning, but a reminder. A seed planted in soil she hadn't even realized was ready to grow. She knew she would be different from this day forward. Not because of embarrassment, but because someone had taken the time to show her what fairness truly looked like. Inside the courtroom, the next case began, but murmurs of the moment lingered among the spectators. People would go home and tell their families about what they saw. They'd talk about the woman who tried to use influence, the husband who refused to compromise his integrity, and the judge who turned a humiliating moment into a lesson on humility, justice, and grace. And long after the day ended, long after the courtroom emptied, one truth would echo in every mind that witnessed it. Sometimes the most savage response isn't punishment, it's mercy.